My name is Vitalii Moroz. I'm head of new media at Internews Ukraine. We're a Ukrainian non-profit working with media, and we're running projects for civil society in internet freedom and digital security for the last 3 years. And I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished panelist, Natalie Gryvnyak. She is a Ukrainian journalist working with international media. She also has her own studio and producing multimedia stories. Thank you for coming. Max Schrems, he is a European tech activist, and Max is a famous personality in European Union because he is fighting tech giants, and in 2018 he founded European Center for Digital Rights. Thank you for coming, Max. Brett Solomon, Executive Director of Access Now. Access Now is probably the biggest international organizations protecting digital rights. Access Now constantly runs the campaign Keep It On, aimed to inform about shutdowns of internet worldwide. And please make friends with Brett, because Access Now runs annually the biggest conference called RightsCon, and it's a famous event. It's a kind of gateway to the understanding of digital rights, and registration, I believe, is free. I hope, yeah. And I want to introduce Mykita Polotayko, head of IT practice at Aekvo law firm. Mykita represents a Ukrainian law firm which is very ambitious and consists of young professionals, and it has very good stake on the market, and we hope to discuss the issues about Ukraine. Our discussions will be focused not only on the international scale level, but also on Ukraine. And I want to start with a little bit explaining the landscape of digital rights in Ukraine, and I believe that it's heavily linked to the landscape of internet in Ukraine. And here in Ukraine we have a very good coffee and very good quality internet, and you should admit, those who live here. Ukrainian internet has never been heavily regulated, and when it was launched, government didn't care about internet at all. And it's all due to good governance in Ukraine, because we have 5 presidents in a row in Ukraine, and compare the situation to our neighbor Belarus, when last free elections took place in 1994, when Lukashenko was elected. It was 25 years ago. So what is the difference now between Ukraine and Belarus in terms of internet? In Ukraine, we have at least 1,500 ISPs, internet service providers, working on the market. Officially, there are more than 6,000 ISPs registered on the market. While in Belarus, you have state-owned controlled Beltelecom and a dozen of state-controlled ISPs. It's a huge difference. Political competitiveness in Ukraine avoided from attempts to control internet in Ukraine. And we have very liberal environment in Ukraine for functioning of internet. But definitely we have many issues in Ukraine now, since we have good governance in time of war. And our new government, they launched great ideas how to push the issue of digital transformation. We have a new Ministry of Digital Transformation. Even so, we don't even have description of what is digital in our legislations. It means that Ukrainian legislation is outdated, and it requires more attention from legislations to bring such terms, for example, as digital evidences in criminal cases, for example. But I would like to start with the general question to each of the panelists, and I want each of you to respond quite briefly, like up to 2 minutes. Here in Ukraine, we have debates between professionals which terms we should use, digital rights or human rights online. Some prefer first, some second. From your perspective, how do you understand digital rights briefly? And secondly, could you please to share the most noticeable for you violations of digital rights from your practice? What happened maybe with you, maybe with your friends, maybe in some country which is more or less close to Ukraine, which lessons should be learned? Thank you. Let's maybe start with Mikita.
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure that the name of these rights are very important, actually. The most important thing is that all of us should have these rights. I want to have access, quality access to the internet, and it's very good news that in Ukraine we have the cheapest broadband internet connection in Europe. And I want to have free speech right even online. And I want to somehow save my privacy even partially when using digital media, when using social media, when using any technological stuff. So I think that the name is not so important. Maybe other panelists think have other thoughts. So as to the limitation of rights, we do remember how just 5 years ago, some of our colleagues or friends had troubles with the law. So some persecution started after just a tweet, after just some post in Facebook, after comments. It wasn't so crucial as we can see from news from our country neighbor, where now we see protests in Moscow and some punishment just for tweets. But we had some tries from government from just 5 years ago, and we hope that it will be just history. So this is the main idea, and the second idea is that the diversity of IPS, yes, it is very important, and it's very important numbers that we have so many separate and independent providers, and I hope that we will care of it.
Thank you, Mikita. Brett, you could probably lecture us about digital rights, but if to make it like simple in a couple of sentences.
Sure. I promise not to lecture anybody. I think that's a bad approach to policy and advocacy work. But I would say that that language is actually really important, which is fine. But no, just in terms of what digital rights are. I think traditionally we understood the concept of digital rights to mean the right to freedom of expression, opinion, association, privacy, and information. Traditionally, there's civil and political rights that are attached traditionally to this concept of what is digital rights. And when you have the name for it, you can protect it, you can define it, you can codify it, you can have remedy against it, etc. The second concept that you mentioned on human rights online, I think, is about how rights across the spectrum are experienced online. So it's not just the civil and political rights, but it's all of the rights. Your right to healthcare, you might experience it offline, but your right to water, your right to life, etc. I think the more important term, which is where I think we're headed, not just from digital rights or human rights online, but human rights in the digital age. And I think that is across, again, from civil and political to economic, social, and cultural rights, so that now that we're in a position when we think about how rights are impacted by technology, all being impacted by technology, we're able to understand how to enjoy them, how they're abused, how to remedy against when the abuse takes place, who's responsible for, where the duty lies, and how citizens in particular are actually able to claim those rights, whether they be online or offline. I think in the context here in Ukraine, obviously, there's a lot of challenges in terms of the enjoyment of rights, like all countries, and I think Ukraine is necessarily particularly egregious, but the right to freedom of expression obviously enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, so how does that get implemented here in real terms, both online and offline? And then, of course, the right to privacy, and Max and others can talk more deeply to that, and I'd like to as well in the context of surveillance infrastructure, and also in the context of censorship, so from freedom of expression and opinion all the way across to privacy. So.
Have you noticed any violations of digital rights in Ukraine from your perspective? Because you oversight many countries, but was Ukraine in the focus of your landscape in a couple of last years?
It was interesting when I wanted to talk about censorship that my microphone went down. Which is essentially about the right to expression and the right to information. And I think that we've seen, certainly in the Ukrainian context, a range of websites, hundreds of websites actually being blocked. What is the legislative provisions that enable that to take place? And what is the legitimate aim, the proportionality, the necessity of that blocking, and who is actually being blocked? We've talked obviously about the relationship with Russia, and many of the sites are actually Russian-related websites which the Ukrainian government is blocking. So, I think it raises some very interesting geopolitical questions, but it also raises questions about the right to expression and the right for Ukrainian citizens to be able to access content. I think another issue that I'd like to raise is the issue of shutdowns, if that's okay, which is about the intentional disruption of the network. And we have seen that here in Ukraine, not necessarily blanket throttling or blanket shutdowns, but there is isolated shutdowns that are taking place in particular regions in Ukraine, which I think is important for us to acknowledge. When we think about access, it's not just about on or off, it's also about the quality of access as well. So whether part of the internet is being censored or blocked, whether there are particular communities that are unable to access content because of that throttling or because of that blockage. And so, if we think about censorship and blocking, I think they're probably the most egregious, but there's obviously issues around privacy surveillance, which are absolutely fundamental, and particularly in the context of an absence of a data protection framework, that's a robust data protection framework in Ukraine.
Thank you. Max, what is your definition of digital rights, and any incidents which you've noticed? You probably noticed many.
We probably get emails every day with stuff, but I probably want to mirror what you said before, and kind of in a practical application. We basically mainly do privacy enforcement, so we basically go to the courts and then fight for the things we have on paper. Because at least in the European Union, we have the wonderful situation that you have all these rights on paper, but you hardly have it in reality because no one goes to court and fights over it. That's especially true when it comes to privacy. And there you usually have these overlaps. If you think of democracy, if you don't have privacy in the voting booth, then if your boss or spouse or whatever knows what you're voting, then your freedom in that moment is limited. So all of these rights are usually very connected. The other way around, we looked into, for example, now a bit of data usage to actually target people. Like if people have a weak spot, something they politically feel about a lot, if you target advertisement at them, then you have the whole fake news debate and possible meddling with democracy. And that's simple data usage. That's oftentimes like this simple GDPR, are you allowed to use my data or not debates, that then are interconnected to other freedom of speech, democracy, and so on rights. And especially interesting in our field, because this right to privacy is oftentimes one of these horizontal rights that is not in itself oftentimes the big issue. Like people don't come to us because, oh my God, someone looked at my data. That's not usually what triggers people. But someone looked at my data and there was this consequences, then usually the connection where people actually start complaining more. And I think that especially shows how they're oftentimes totally interlinked and interconnected, and it's really hard for me in any logical way or in any meaningful way to separate and say, there's this bucket and the other one, and the one is more important than the other. Because in reality, obviously something like democracy is hugely important, but then in the courtroom you have to operationalize it. You have to say this company has taken this information, was therefore able to target this person and screw with their political opinions because they suddenly had the idea that, I don't know, in Austria, we're now like all over, we have like all refugees all over, and we now have to flee our own houses because it's also terrible, because people hear that 24/7 on Facebook and without anybody really being in their front yard. And that's an interesting situation, but comes down to a private company and how you can target, for example, on a platform, and how much they are able to extract highly personal information out of your data sets, which is a business issue. So we oftentimes also have the overlap now between the private actors and the public actors. That's something that we see a lot. We only look at private actors, but we automatically run into the government even if you only look at private actors, because, for example, how the US does it with the NSA is that they basically have private actors in our cell phones, in our devices that suck up the data, and then the government is like, oh great, someone already did the collection for us, we're just going to get it from them. So it's very interesting because it's all interconnected somehow and interrelated.
Yeah, we are coming closer to the idea of cybersecurity and personal digital security, and probably discuss it. I want to address to Natalia. Among all of us, we are on the side of research of digital rights and protect digital rights. And you're a practitioner, so journalists are very sensitive target audiences, and journalists are often attacked. What is your understanding of digital rights? And do you happen to know within your friends or in Ukraine generally, in the media landscape, if there were quite noticeable attacks which violated digital rights?
Well, first of all, good day, everyone, and thank you for the invitation for this panel. For me, digital rights in my field, which is media and also civil society, is basically is providing me a right to express myself freely, but based on the general human rights and general values, which is a must to have in order to have a right to express yourself. So from my practice, I do have a lot of colleagues that did receive some messages on Facebook or Twitter that would be with some rude quotes or giving names, etc. There are some colleagues of mine that even had a persistent number of threats that they have received through, and bullying. I'm calling this bullying or stalking, via messages for almost 1.5 years, describing their articles and their involvement with the interviewing political people. So some of them had a desire to hide away, to not to show off so much of their work. In my experience, since I'm writing for predominantly international media, I do receive comments that are different. Some agree with me, some not. But those people that do not agree with me, I'm just taking it as a chance to explain further, the situation that, as in the previous panel, journalists were saying that indeed there is just a small amount of information coming from one topic to another, and to go deeply within one information, you need to be more profound in whatever you're providing. So I think in Ukraine is much better situation than in other countries, like for instance our neighboring Russia, definitely much better. But we still have surveillance, we do have stalking, we do have persistence from the authorities, to read your, like in the famous cases of journalists, to read your data in case you are in the interrogation, session. So I think that journalists and media and civil society activists should be more protected in our country, definitely, because we do have a lot to say, we do have a lot to share, and Ukraine should be kind of a foundation in this part of the world, and for the origins of a better democracy and of a better freedom of speaking, we should be kind of like an example and giving an example for other neighboring countries here.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Now I would like to address to Brad. Like 10 years ago here in Ukraine, it was a period when every non-profit organizations try to explain how to use social media, and we teach a lot how to use Facebook for journalists, Twitter, and so on. But at that time, in 2010, such writer as Evgeny Morozov, he wrote a brilliant book which is called The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom. And there was early signs of alarm that please be careful with technology, and government will always be much more powerful than activists and civil society in using sophisticated equipment, because technology is something that is controlled by intelligence services. These intelligence services might be wise enough or not wise enough, but still they have all capacities to control, to make surveillance, and so on. And now we have clear understanding that the governments may use technologies against democracy. And we presumably acknowledge that non-democratic governments may use technologies against civil society. But what about also about democratic countries where, for example, private business may create, for example, surveillance equipment or software and sell it to non-democratic countries? The question to you, we have a new government and it has very high stake in transformation of this country. What would you advise regarding digital rights, on what our government should take care and should focus in protecting digital rights of Ukrainian users?
Thank you, and it's interesting that you mentioned Morozov's book, because for many of us, I think, who were around in 2009 and looked at the kind of opportunities of new technology and social media and the Twitter revolution and the response to Ahmadinejad's election in Iran and that sense of possibility, which so quickly and I think prophetically Morozov kind of indicated, like, hey, you guys better watch out. And so kudos to him for his insight into the future. I think the securitization of the internet is probably one of our biggest challenges, and it's not just here in Ukraine, but the idea that the national security agenda needs to define the digital environment. And so there are obviously reasons and rationales for that, and you can see in democracies and non-democracies alike, it's not just authoritarian states that are securitizing the infrastructure, that are passing new cybercrime and cybersecurity bills, that are passing fake news laws, but democracies as well are caught up in this kind of messianic approach of, like, we need to create secure infrastructure, we need the criminalization of expression in order to secure the state, we need to ensure that minority voices are penalized if they challenge the dominant authority. And I think that for us, the opposite is true. The openness of the internet is the thing that provides the security, the protection of rights is the thing that enables society to operate securely and safely. And I give you an example. I mentioned you also on internet shutdowns. So we run a coalition called the Keep It On Coalition, which is about 200 NGOs, which is focused on trying to stop the intentional disruptions of the network. And often what happens is you find governments are like, 196 internet shutdowns last year. There'll be more than that this year. We're on track to significantly see that number surpassed. And so what happens is governments are like, well, there's a protest, we're going to turn the internet off. Often that is also a precursor to some sort of egregious human rights abuse. But the consequence for the community is communities are unable to access the internet, unable to know where the safe or unsafe places are, unable to contact emergency services and so on. So what is designed from a state perspective to be around the securitization of the population and of the state actually turns into panic and mayhem and the lack of security. And I think that so my message to the government is that, a message to the government is that in the conception of what is the future of the internet, and we need to remember that this is just the beginning of the digital revolution, this is just the start of it, that those rights of expression, opinion association, etc., are fundamental to the security of the state. And also as the counterpoint to neighbours, as you mentioned, I think that we need to have a free and vibrant press. You don't get a free and vibrant press by, intimidation of journalists. And it's not just the harassment, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but it's also the cyber attacks that we're seeing directly in technical attacks. And we've documented literally dozens of cases over this last 18 months in Ukraine of journalists and bloggers and members of civil society who are being cyber attacked. The answer is not securitization of the internet, it's a rights-respecting internet. And that means protections, that means the implementation of the Constitution in the digital environment, and it also means rights-respecting cybersecurity laws.
Brett, I also want to ask you the question. Now in Ukrainian legislation, like the new parliament in Ukraine, which is active since like last month, they had a legislation which might shrink the anonymity of users. For example, if you use cell phones and mobile communication, you're not required to be registered. But this norm is provided in many European countries, so you can get a SIM card without showing your ID, in fact. And in Ukraine, like civil society, like was attacking and asking, like we enjoy full anonymity, and security services might appeal with the idea that we live in the time of terrorism. So the Ukraine is on the level which is far behind many European countries which normalize the identification of users. Would you, if you were advisor to our Prime Minister, for example, would you say go to with these European practices or stay, don't shrink the freedom, the current state of anonymity in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I think, you probably know what my answer is going to be. I think that the question of anonymity is essential to a functioning democracy. Anonymity is very much connected to privacy. But if you think about, what you say and what you say if somebody is actually watching you, and I think there's been a number of studies, including one from PEN America recently, or semi-recently, which is like journalists and authors talking about what they write if they're actually being surveilled or monitored. It changes. You change the way you think about what you do behind. There's a reason why we have curtains on our, on our doors. It's because we have a sense of privacy and a sense of anonymity, and I think it's essential that we have that in the digital environment. The identification, the sort of registration of SIM cards to individuals is deeply problematic. I understand the security aspect of it, but particularly, as I say, beginning of the digital revolution, if you think about the SIM card connected to your digital identity, so your biometrics, connected to your geolocation, connected to the Internet of Things, it more shows the absolute importance of anonymity, because what will happen is, what is going to happen, and somebody mentioned, Xinjiang in China, where you have this sense where everything is linked, your digital identity, which will be, and I think in Ukraine we've just seen a regulation that just got passed just in last month, this idea that, your digital identity will be your entry point to the digital economy, it'll be your entry point to the digital society. So if you're constantly tracked, monitored, geolocated, you can think about, I see this really as the end of individual autonomy. And if Ukraine wants to pursue, a democratic future, the end of individual autonomy is actually the authoritarian state. So,
thank you. We do believe that we have good perspectives, since I always mention that Ukraine has very aggressive civil society, and any legislation, any draft law which comes against the interest of civil society might be overturned. I want to address to Max. Max, you were a pioneer of filing suit cases against tech giants. And the first one was in 2011, as far as I remember. And later, your example was followed by national governments in EU and European Commission. So they probably copycat your practices. So you're pioneering it. But here in Ukraine, we have a choice. Ukrainian users have a choice between Russian social networks and websites and Western social networks and websites. And in terms of choosing between these two options, we are much more loyal to Western platforms like Facebook, Google, and so on, because we believe that they're much more safe for us compared to the Russians. And we would like to join any European created instruments, tools, but Europe unfortunately haven't created much. But Europe is fighting US tech giants. But the system, this ecosystem of tech giants is evolving, and we see that they have become more and more responsive to the interest of users. I want to believe in it. For example, Facebook created a position of policy manager for Ukraine, who is occupied by a prominent Ukrainian journalist, and we believe that it's like good steps. But still, from your experience of fighting for the privacy of users, how would you estimate, is tech giants became more open and transparent, and what is the key milestones? What are future fights with tech giants?
I have a hard time to talk about Russian social media, as we have never really dealt with it, to be honest, so I cannot make any educated comment on it. We looked mainly into Facebook on these things and US law on it, and I think it strongly depends on what your threat model is. Like, if your threat model is being a journalist here, it's not overly likely that the NSA is going to be overly interested in that, reporting about something local. So the reality is like, even if a local government would ask for it, like if the Austrian government would ask for my data at Facebook, Facebook would probably tell them, get lost. Because there's no realistic avenue to get there. However, in other situations and for other activists in other areas, it's fundamentally different, because at least under US law, as long as you're not a US citizen or permanent resident, you do not have any privacy rights under the Fourth Amendment, and the FISA Act, that's the relevant act, allows basically what we call mass collection. The US calls it bulk collection. There's like difference in wording, but pretty massive surveillance possibilities. And that's oftentimes, for example, interesting from a European perspective, again, on sanctions. So, for example, Austria is one of the countries that was not overly engaged in the Russian sanctions, and there's usually sufficient trade between Austria and Russia. So for a lot of Austrian companies, it's relevant, or also with Iran, like Austria was, as a neutral country, oftentimes a connecting point to other countries. So for our industry, it's sometimes relevant if I put something on a cloud service of one of these companies. Is that then later going to be used to sanction me because I didn't follow some US law that is not even a law in Europe? So it fundamentally depends on if you're a journalist here, if you're a business there, what your threat model is, and I think that's really, really complicated to answer. Therefore, what I'm generally afraid is we see, for example, in the EU, all these ideas of, I don't know, tracking all the flights. Now they're debating tracking all the train connections where you went on, buses, or so we're doing the same thing to a large extent. And that is fundamentally a problem, because it's going to be harder and harder to differentiate, as you said before, between the Western democracy that is like all fun and games and so on, and systems as we see them in China, for example. And because technology makes it technically possible and rather easy and cheap, the intention by politicians all over the world is to think about all these ideas. We just had the SIM cards in Austria, I think, half a year ago. I think 1st of September was the first date where you actually had to kind of have an ID or prove your ID, otherwise your SIM card is shut down. The reality of all of this is bullshit anyways, because if I want to have a SIM card that's not personalized, I just drive over to the Czech Republic, which takes 45 minutes from Vienna, and I get a SIM card there, and I bypassed it anyways. But or you go through some browsers, or you have ways to do that if you really want it. But the problem is that many people, and that's what you mentioned before, in their daily life are then changing their behavior, because they have the feeling, oh, if I posted, someone could theoretically through, I don't know, Facebook, whatever, say that. Or if I'm a journalist, or if I put that online, someone could figure out that I was actually researching that, even if I'm probably not included in the reporting and so on. And that fundamentally changes behavior. That's all the chilling effects debate and so on. And that's oftentimes what I'm, in practice, oftentimes more afraid of than the actual misuse. Because think of the one misuse case, but you usually then have 1,000 people that shut up because of knowing that there was this one misuse. And that's all these like side events that we see, and I think that's all over the place. Like that's debated in Brussels to pass laws like that, just like in China, like not the same level obviously, but the general avenue, the general direction is pretty similar, I think. And we see hardly new, like GDPR was the one big new privacy legislation, but for example, the government sector, we're looking for years and years and years to get new protections that level up with it. For example, in Austria, there are certain things that are not approved by a judge. And it's just like the more you intervene with the privacy of people, the more I also want the judge to actually approve that. So to kind of level up the protection while you have like more interference and so on, and that usually lags behind. And I see that as more of a global trend.
Max, could you please like to continue to explain the audiences the EU ruling on the case of safe harbor? You did a lot like to stop it here, like transferring personal data to US, but looks like that still the data from EU users are still transferred to the United States, or I'm not right.
It's a rather complicated case, I have to say sorry before I start explaining already. So basically the European data protection law works that way that it generates a bubble. It says we have proper protection within the EU, so therefore no data is allowed to go outside, because if, I don't know, Switzerland wouldn't have proper privacy protections, it would go there, go in the internet, then it would be gone. So it's kind of like an export control for our data. Now, we do have third countries that basically have the same level or the same law as the EU. Typical example is Switzerland, where you can still freely transfer data there because, or Israel, for example, and a couple of these countries. The US does not have a general data protection law, but it came up with a self-certification mechanism, so certain companies could kind of, in simple terms, sign a letter saying, hereby I follow EU law, actually a lower standard, but that was the idea, and thereby are in a civil law contract or in civil law sense, bound to follow that. The big problem was that in the US at the same time there were these surveillance laws. So the company signed on paper, hereby we protect your privacy. At the same time, once the NSA knocks on our door, we have to follow that and not the contract. So there was a fundamental conflict between the law in the US and the commitments of these US companies. And that's oftentimes a problem of these companies, to be fair. Because if you're Facebook or Google, you have to protect privacy under GDPR in the European Union. At the same time, you have to follow the surveillance laws of China, Russia, the US, or the UK or France as well that have pretty severe, or Germany, pretty severe surveillance laws as well. So that's an interesting situation, especially if we think of a global internet, because the consequence of all of this is to a certain extent what they call balkanization of the internet, so really kind of separating it up. And that was the one part about this case that we brought that I was actually pissed about, because the only consequence from this case was that data has to be kept in the EU to a certain extent. And that automatically leads to a separated internet somehow, and that gets back to the 80s of the big question of who governs the internet. Because if one country screams at a company, you got to do A, the other country screams you got to do Z, then the company's automatically in between and cannot comply. So the whole case went to the Court of Justice. This whole thing was done under a data sharing agreement between the EU and the US. It was struck down. The Court of Justice said we're right and you cannot send data to the US in these situations. But the political reality was that the US called up Brussels and said, oh, we want for our companies access to the market again. And 3 months later, they basically passed the same law with a new title. So the old one was called Safe Harbor, now it's called Privacy Shield. And then the text that follows that title is pretty much the same. And that's a typical thing we also have, like in Austria, when we have constitutional challenges, is constitutional courts tell you you're right. But the truth is a constitutional challenge costs 2-3 years, usually. To pass the law again takes usually a day. And so you override the law, you finally win in the Supreme Courts, and then they just pass the same law a day later and say, let's run again for 3 years. Until then, the law is there. And that's exactly what the European Commission did in this case. They just passed it again and said, you know, until until this is going to be overturned by the Court of Justice again, I'm not going to be the Justice Commissioner anymore. And they actually made it, like it's going to be overturned in January, and now we have a new commission. So 3 months, they actually made it to not be in charge of it once it's overturned again.
Okay, thank you. We'll be back to the issue of legislation because Ukraine might follow not Russian legislation but European legislation and might enforce some or copycat like these initiatives. I want to address to Natalia, as a practitioner, as a journalist, we talk a lot about privacy, about data protection, but what is the reality within Ukrainian journalism? Are they aware about the issues of data protection? Do they use Facebook less and less? Because as I understand, Ukrainian journalists and politicians, they do enjoy of having Facebook as a platform. In Ukraine, some ministers are called to be like Facebook ministers because they are competing how many likes they will have, how many followers they will have. So they are very addicted to this platform. And I believe, like I see Maxi smiling, like it's strange. It would be strange for Western countries to see that politicians are competing to get more followers. In fact, maybe, but in Ukraine we have huge attention to social media because
in the West it's Twitter.
Yeah, because it is a direct channel to the audience, to the voters, and they can appeal. And the last presidential campaign was heavily based on extensive use of social media. And for our panel, we expected to be joined by Vice Prime Minister, who would explain us how they see the use of social media, probably. But from your perspective, what is the use of social media? Is there awareness about privacy and data protection?
Well, from my perspective, Facebook is still a predominant, channel for many politicians because, I mean, of the grasp of the community that they can have. But according to the new algorithms of Facebook, it's a little bit difficult, to gain the audience that it was easier to get before. So for now, the content is important. And of course, there's this issue of bots, that, could comment and, attack the person who is posting something on Facebook. From what I understand, we do lack education in data protection. And I'm very thankful there are a couple institutions in Ukraine that do provide some seminars and do provide some workshops on how to protect your data and how to post something, and to protect your Facebook authenticity, etc. So I think that this is predominantly what we need to do as a next step, is to literate as many journalists and as many civil society or public, governance people, just to be more educated how to be protected. I think that for now we do demand more official, more official statements. But Facebook would be still, like social media, would be still a very, very high competitive, platform for sharing information.
Thank you. Just a quick reflections. In Ukraine, we have a lot of projects targeted on media literacy, but less there is a talk about digital literacy, because understanding of media, understanding of content and how the content can be manipulated is one thing, but understanding the nature of technologies, how they can be used against humans, it's something else. So, and in fact, any kind of digital security trainings help to understand what is the limitation of technologies and what is their expense.
And I wanted to add as well that we do need some more protection in case of stalking, online stalking, Facebook stalking, etc., and against bot attacks. We do need more protection and more instruments and tools against it. So and more even legislation, because in legislation we do not have also anything against stalking. So it's only physical threats, then it's an open criminal charge. So I do think that we need some updates in this matter as well.
Access Now has a helpline which do a lot of work to help journalists, civic activists in many countries. Brett, would you comment?
for sure. I just wanted to actually pick up on the data protection point, because when you said, like, you know, what would you tell the government, and which is a rare opportunity that you actually, you know, get to, well, that's not totally true. We do get to sit down with governments and provide perspectives and opportunities, but I do think that, you know, Ukraine has a really interesting opportunity now with this new government and this at this particular moment. And the issue of data protection, my organisation has been working on it for a number of years, actually, not just like post-GDPR, but actually we worked through our Brussels office on the GDPR for like 5 years in terms of the tech. So, and it's only, like, ironically, just recently that I've really totally understood the absolute imperative of proper data protection frameworks, because, and Max is kind of like rolling his eyes probably, but the point is that data protection actually is the building block of everything. And I say that, I mentioned the idea of digital identity and the collection of data on you, like your identity, your biometrics. That is data. That's the most sensitive data in a way that there is, right? So, but digital identity is being created, or identities are being warehoused in the absence of proper data protection frameworks all over the world. And it's just about to happen here as well. Data protection is the basis of protection against unwarranted surveillance as well. So if you think about the brilliant work that Max has been doing, which is about how is your data protected in the context of this massive collection industry, which is like, you know, all of these companies that are collecting data, how is that data actually protected in a way that gives the rights back to the owner of the data? And one of the panelists was talking before about you own your data. So it's like, it's digital identity, it's communication surveillance, it's elections. Like you can't have a robust democratic process of election in the absence of a data protection framework. So as well as the non-securitization of the internet, I would also say that absolute priority should be a proper, robust data protection framework. And that means an oversight body, that means remedy, that means transparency, that means, you know, proper legislative frameworks that are available to the public. And actually we have this great document which is called the Do's and Don'ts of Data Protection. It's a guide for lawmakers. It's the 10 lessons which we've learned over working on the GDPR and the lead up to. So I would say, like, of absolute importance. On digital security and civil society actors, I mean, again, like the thing that activists, journalists, bloggers, etc., ultimately are trying to protect is their data, even if they don't see it like that. They're trying to protect, you know, their sources. They're trying to protect their content. They're trying to protect their communication channels to make sure that they're secure. It's all just data, and so, you know, as I say, there are many attacks that are happening against particular minority communities here in Ukraine, including members of the LGBT community, journalists, bloggers, etc. And so, yeah, I don't know if you wanted me to talk more on that, but I can.
Okay, now we'll need a voice of lawyers, I believe, because it's very important to talk about the legal issues. And last year, European Union accepted GDPR, which is very important legislation to protect users' privacy, and it's maybe used like in different ways, like within GDPR regulations. European Commission may fine companies, I believe, and there is a position of special persons who will follow like any kind of violations. Mikita, we are not part of European Union yet. But we are moving forward. But still, GDPR does affect Ukrainian business, Ukrainian companies, and maybe Ukrainian government. Could you please explain what is the challenges of GDPR and what other digital rights comes like with not just privacy, but some new aspects of digital rights which we might not even know now?
You see, it would be a very complicated task to tell about GDPR in 2 minutes. It is a very large and important document. However, actually, we don't need to be a part of a member of European Union to have the same legislation here in Ukraine. Actually, our current data protection law is based on the previous European Union directive on data protection. It's not bad, actually. It doesn't work sufficiently, unfortunately. And we see that now in Ukraine we have consent-addicted data protection industry. I mean that in any contract you will find very big text of wording of consent, and this is consent for everything. For transfer abroad of your personal data, for any use, etc., etc., etc. So one of the main ideas of GDPR is you should take as much data as you need to serve your client, not more. Maybe if you receive some consent, you may take more data, but you should explain for what needs, how you will use it, etc., etc., etc. So we have the different situation in Ukraine. Very good example. I think that many of you have iPhones or other Apple tech equipment, and these devices have such option as find where it is right now. When you lost, for example, your device, you may block it remotely and you may find it. So to enact this option, you should give consent to Apple to use your location data. And are we confident that our data will be used only for this purpose? I'm confident that it will be used for many purposes, not only for this goal. So I think that even the most that all technological giants do the same thing. They use our data not only to serve us, but Ukrainian entrepreneurs do even more because I know that here a lot of Ukrainians, and I'm sure that most of you have received few SMSs from taxi providers today or tomorrow, maybe even 10 SMS a day. So this situation shows how bad our data protection law works right now. And it is not trouble with quality of wording of law or clauses. So this is trouble with enforcement and with maybe with size of fines. Okay, going back to GDPR, we had a brilliant discussion today about artificial intelligence here on this forum, and by the way, GDPR prohibits to make decision based only on results of AI analysis. So each of us has a right to know the algorithm, how the decision regarding ourselves is made, and we have guarantees. We will have guarantees. Okay, when we are in EU, we have these guarantees because GDPR actually applies to Ukrainians when we travel in EU also, for example. So we have guarantees that decision regarding us will not be made based on some algorithms that is not just machine learning or big data analysis or something like this. So this is a very good question whether it is necessary, because we have privacy on the one hand and need to develop technologies on the other hand. And it is very good idea to business. It is very profitable to have automated decision making regarding, for example, credits or something, or some other very popular product. Okay, so the question was regarding challenges of GDPR, yes? And
I mean, like what does it mean for Ukrainian business and for Ukrainian users? Does GDPR more regulates like private business, or it has huge impact on our personal lives?
Actually, it is very popular meaning that GDPR is aimed just to protect our personal data. It's true, but it's not all true. Actually, GDPR also aimed to make free personal data flow within European Union, and they made it. And we hope that when we enter European digital single market, we would also be part of this data exchange. But we need to implement GDPR for this purpose also. So going back to Ukrainians are not protected by GDPR unless we are traveling in EU or live there. However, GDPR is applicable to many Ukrainian businesses, especially online and IT businesses that are targeted to provide services to European Union citizens, etc. So we feel GDPR here in Ukraine, but we have very specific Ukrainian approach. Many companies just want to have very good-looking privacy policy and stop their activities and preparation on this point. So we made just some front without backend, without real work on protection, without real work on dedicating which data is processed, how long do we process this with sufficient notification of users, of data subjects, etc., etc., etc. Okay, I can talk about GDPR about a day or even two, so please stop me.
Okay, yeah, let's turn to the issue, like continue like with GDPR. It's definitely the GDPR might influence like tech giants, and this is like European regulations. And we talked previously on this forum about algorithm transparency. What we as users of internet, as civil society, can we influence on tech giants to push them to make their algorithms more transparent? Because definitely we are here in this audience, we don't know how much information tech giants collect about us, and we are aware on not posting, like not letting everyone post information about us. But still, within this triangle, government, tech giants, as private business, and civil society might look like the weakest link, because tech giants want to speak to government first, and secondly to civil society. How can we reinforce our position, and how we can, Max has a great example of crowdsourcing, of posting on the website appeal to send claims against Facebook, and you collected 20,000 probably signatures, yeah, or claims. How we as civil society can influence tech giants? Can we push for transparency of algorithms? Will we be successful, or this is like, or will be like Don Quixote, which trying to fight something surreal?
Just quickly on the GDPR issue before, one thing that I think is important from a non-EU perspective is the EU has a huge incentive that other countries follow the European model. So there is a push by the Commission to have as many countries in the world adequate as possible. And that is a train that is like probably to a certain extent a bit unusual, that they're, I think, rather proactive if something happens in other countries. And because there is a bit of a battle between the US and the EU on that, so I think that's usually interesting. In your question, there was a lot of transparency baked in, and transparency, I think, is a nice first step. But the biggest problem we had in the privacy world so far is that they were totally transparent about the fact that they misuse your data. You just didn't have any option to say no or to go away. And so it's a bit of a situation, and I think a lot of the transparency in privacy comes from a US approach that they call notice and choice, and I think that's oftentimes important to understand, is To explain in a simple way, I was in LA and I rented a car for a week at Hertz. There was a huge sticker on the screen saying, this car may contain substances that cause birth defects, cancer, blah, 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 blah. And now this was a transparent sticker saying, if you use this car, you may die. And then my choice was to sit in the car or not. And that's kind of this notice and choice thing. So it's transparent, but my choice is to walk or take the car. And instead of saying, okay, if there's really, cancer-causing materials, then we should probably just get rid of the materials instead of putting a sticker on it. And so I think a lot of the transparency is the first step to realize what the problems are and to be able to, have statistics about, I don't know how many takedowns there are in each country, how aggressive governments try to really get stuff from providers and so on. That's all doable through transparency. But when it comes to privacy, the problem is the average user does not understand that. Like, I worked on Facebook for 8 years now, and I don't understand how Facebook works. And because it's so complex and so multi-layered that not even an engineer at Facebook probably fully knows how the product works. So we get more to an issue where I think we have to have honest control, as you mentioned before, to have like the possibility to have a yes or no opt-in, to really say, I want this or I don't want this, not hidden somewhere in the background where you agreed to it, but you've never actually realized that you agreed. And I think that is something that GDPR does reasonably well. I think GDPR is probably the least stupid privacy law we know so far. There's way to improve to make it better. And I think these are the elements that we should probably look into more. We then use these tools and then enforce them, because what you mentioned before as well is it's wonderful to have these things on paper, but if in reality no one follows it, then nothing changes in real life and in daily practices of a person on the street. And that is the biggest problem we have in Europe so far, where we're great in telling everybody else how wonderful our privacy laws are, but Facebook still violates them to date. We still have the pending cases where they fundamentally violate the most principal rules of GDPR, knowing that they're just going to litigate that now for 10 years and still make a shitload of money for 10 years until they're finally forced to actually comply with it. And I think that is also something that we have to learn in the digital sphere more, is the digital culture is oftentimes, in a lot of these startups, is a break it culture, a fuck the rules, which is going to do what we think is right issue. And that becomes an issue for democracy and the rule of law, because if, for example, the penalties in Austria before GDPR were 20,000 euros, so asking a lawyer how to comply with GDPR as a big company was way more expensive than just paying the fine. And these are, I think, the structural things where we can see everything that we've done wrong so far, and hopefully in other digital areas as well, improve. Last sentence on that, one thing that I'm not happy about is that we have to come up with these big sticks. Like, I don't like the government to say there's a 4%, 20 million euros fine, and you're gonna basically be economically wrecked if you just, like, we should be in a society where big companies, large enterprises generally follow human rights, fundamental rights, and so on without having to kill them otherwise. But that's a bit of a problem with the Silicon Valley culture of certain companies. I have to highlight that certain companies, it's by far not everybody.
I want to turn to our audience now. We're talking about big ideas about human rights, and we see ourselves as citizens who has rights and some obligations. But first of all, we are customers to tech giants. And I would ask each of you, please raise your hands, those who already, as customers, pay for some online services. Could you please? Like, half of you pay for some online services. And it means that you might use Netflix and pay for it, but also, like, Netflix was also probably the company which you sue, Max, probably, yeah. But now I want to ask you, who of you is ready to pay Facebook for using it if your privacy will be much better protected, if your data will not be transferred to the States? Could you please raise your hands?
Just add one sentence to that question.
Much more, thank you.
Just to give you an idea, the revenue of Facebook per user is about 4 euros a year. So if you would only pay 4 euros, you would basically have no advertisement on Facebook, no shitty shit that usually is covering what you actually want to see of your friends, and no privacy violation. So you have to also look at the numbers. The numbers that are generated through the misuse of that data are so trivial that a lot of people would probably pay that amount. If you looked at Netflix, that is much more that people pay a month. But anyways.
So
yeah, Brett.
Whilst we're jumping in, it'd be good if we all had microphones as well, because then we could. But anyway, the problem with that question is paying for privacy is like the classes that, whether it's €4 or €40, the idea that one has to actually pay in order to enforce their rights is problematic. And I think that the ultimate consequence of something like that is that privacy becomes the purview of the rich or of the privileged, and it's the minorities, the indigenous people, the non-English speaking communities, you know, you name it, who won't have access to the rights. And I think we need to ensure that rights are provided to people not on the basis of purchasing capacity, but still.
Yeah.
Just one note, let's think how we could communicate regarding this issue and any other issue, how we can plan our activities, how to push on tech giants without using their services, where we will discuss it, where we will message each other.
Good questions. I would like to suggest you to prepare some questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. But before I'll give floor to our respected audience, I would like to ask you the final question of our discussion. And it also concerns our digital rights. In Ukraine, we have now discussions about possibility of drafting disinformation law, the law which will enable Ukrainian government or Ukrainian society to fight disinformation on the eve of elections as a temporary measures, but it might come in a conflict with their access to information and freedom of speech. And Ukraine always looking on EU example, and French came up with this idea. So when we looked on EU landscape, we see that, okay, this is like France's democracy, they might have a right idea. So what would you recommend? What should be, what we should take into account if Ukrainian parliament will come to idea, let's fight Russian disinformation campaign via some legislation? What are the key safeguards in it?
So the push towards disinformation legislation, or countering disinformation legislation and countering fake news, is one that we're seeing in jurisdictions all over the world. And there's so much political pressure on both governments and on companies to regulate speech. And so I think it's really important, whilst we see all of the rationale and reason for it, and we see it on the digital security, like we see firsthand the consequences of the weaponization of information. But I'm just going to play the counterpoint to this, because in order to determine fake news or disinformation, you need to monitor the network, so you need to establish a surveillance regime. In order to remove content which is deemed to be, you know, illegal, hate speech, you know, fake news, whatever, disinformation, you need to set up a censorship regime to remove it. And then often you also have to put alternative content there, so you need a propaganda machine to provide the content that you want people to see. So in the essence of trying to protect the democracy, you're creating all the hallmarks of an authoritarian state. And given the history of the region and of Ukraine, I would be very, very cautious about creating infrastructure that regulates speech in that way. So I want to just play that side of the game, because I think that there is so much political pressure, as I say, in order to create the infrastructure that would regulate and protect society from fake news and disinformation.
Max and Natalia, especially because you're a practitioner and disinformation law will target journalists. In Ukraine, we have many discussions about the quality of journalism, and it's very easy to obtain journalist press card without not being journalist, which is kind of challenge, because we are, as I mentioned before, we live in very liberal society with no regulations probably at all. So, and it may be misused by those who want to misuse, but we still should believe that majority of us want to use technology and their rights like for the benefit of society, not against it. Natalia, if the legislation on misinformation would be developed, will it make some obstacles for your work, or it will help you to bring even better stories?
I think it will create obstacles, and it will be also the ban on the freedom of expression as well, from my perception. Because I think that in order for us to have more protection, we need to have more transparency. And throughout my experience from the media field, we do have a lot of media that are right now, we all know, controlled by different, business people and, different interests. But as soon as we got a law about transparency and about obliged information about who owns what media, how it is being done, and all of these journalist investigations, etc., they're doing a fantastic job. I think we need more transparency and more media literacy among population, not only in big cities or in the predominant active class of the society, but also the majority of the society. We need to target them, we need to address them, because for the moment they are right now the core, voting audience. And unfortunately, as we just seen, you don't need a lot of, media interviews to provide information about your political, agenda. So I think you need to have more literacy and more transparency. That's my idea.
Thank you, Max.
I mean, I'm really not an expert in that area, I have to say, first of all. But one thing that always struck me is we have also an issue to push good information more on these platforms. So to give you an example, in Austria or Germany, we have huge public broadcasting companies that are somewhat neutral, that produce good quality, and they have to delete all the online content within 7 days. So Russia Today spams all of like YouTube and so on with their stuff. But our public broadcaster that is independent, that fulfills all these criteria, is not allowed to put it on YouTube. So I think, and the same thing if you look at, I oftentimes, when we talk about digital rights, I oftentimes like to look at how we did stuff 100 years ago, because oftentimes we had very similar problems, or 50 years ago. To give an example, for example, in Austria, we were one of the latest to have private radio, only end of the 90s. We were like the last in the EU. But for example, the government basically put in the law that you have to have 10 minutes per, I think it's 10 minutes or whatever, per hour of information, of neutral information. It would be not unreasonable to tell Facebook you have to have 10% of your newsfeed be somewhat neutral information, or somewhat information that is somewhat good. Like, there's going to be endless debates of what that neutral information is. But the question does arise if we have onuses on, for example, cable providers. It's totally normal that we say the cable provider has to have the public broadcaster for free without them paying and so on. If we have new platforms, the question also arises, it's very hard to get the bad content off, and there's tons of problems on how to do that. And you can talk 10 times more about that than I do. But I think what's interesting to talk about as well is how we can push good news and good media more into the streams, and also probably to a certain extent tell them you have a public duty as a platform provider to also provide that, just like we tell cable net companies that they have to do that. That's something that I was always kind of wondering in that, but probably you have more in it.
Just quickly to respond, and it'd be great to hear from the audience as well. And I just with some folks from Myanmar last week, and they're dealing with this issue of fake news and basically atrocities as a result of that content, with incitement to violence and disinformation and so on. And the message that was coming from them was not removal; it was demotion. Like, we're not asking for the content to be taken off, we're asking for the algorithm to be amended in a way that actually reduces its prevalence and thus the position that it is on the feed. And I think there's an interesting play there.
Thank you. Now I feel it's a time to pass the floor to our respected audiences. We'll have 10 minutes for 3-4 questions, please. Roman. would you please bring the microphone? And please specify to whom you are asking.
Okay, thank you. I'm Roman Romanov, Human Rights and Justice Program Director at the International Renaissance Foundation. So we are at a good governance forum, and my question is, it's easy to justify the interest of civil society if we are talking about balance between the state civilians and the rights of privacy. But if the government is telling you, we want to compete with the commercials, we want to bring you the same quality services as they are, and for that reason, we want to unify the databases, we want to match your personal data from different databases just to be able to be efficient. It's much harder actually to mobilize the civil society towards the data protection work, since like everyone is interested in quality public services. So that's kind of situation there we are, because like the new government and the president already announced quite ambitious policy towards digitalization and improved public services. So what would you say there are the red lines? Should we be ready to the idea that one day, you know, the state would become a kind of cloud with, you know, with all your data to be moving between different databases, but at the end, you benefit from high quality public services? So maybe for Brett and Max.
Oh, microphone, please.
Was it efficiency versus rights? Is that the question? You know, I came through to the UK last week, and I got to the airport and I put my passport, like when the doors opened and I was in, you know, within like 15 seconds, and suddenly I was like on the plane and then in a taxi, and I was like, man, this is awesome. You know, the facial recognition, the data, you know, checking off the database, etc., and I'm an approved citizen or approved traveller, and through I go. So I totally understand this, you know, the play off there. But I do, you know, I sort of, as I'd mentioned, like it sort of played out to the worst case scenario, and I'm sorry to be the sort of the doomsday guy, but, you know, ultimately without the protections in place, the efficiencies, you know, don't necessarily get you ultimately to where you would like to be. What are the sort of red lines? I guess, you know, if we come back to the topic of digital rights, like how do we ensure in the design of the systems that I just don't think it's a playoff necessarily. I think in the design of the system is if you can do a human rights assessment as you're looking at how, you know, data is collected in terms of data minimization, for example, or who has access to that data for that purpose, or, you know, like there's many different steps that I think are involved in the process in order to give the kind of efficiencies that a modern democracy in the digital age requires without actually, you know, infringing on people's rights. It's a long and involved question. I totally understand the issues, but I think I would definitely err on the side of rights protection over efficiency, particularly for marginalised communities as well.
Max,
may I add something more lawyerish to it, and I support everything you've said already. I think, for example, at least under our GDPR model, the biggest red line that we usually have is purpose limitation. So if I go to a doctor, I usually want that doctor to know as much about my body in that moment to cure me and to help me. And I'm totally open, and they can, you know, look into all, like my noses and whatever, and that's like what you would usually never have any other person share information with. But for the sole purpose to cure me. And I think that's then the interesting thing, is that through things like purpose limitation, or if you look at research, anonymization options, so that this data may be used for a secondary purpose, but in an anonymous way, I think out of a combination of these things, we can overcome most of these conflicts, so to say. And I just want to mirror what you said. I think most of the people that are like at the core privacy debate are usually the kids that kind of took apart their computer when they were 5 years old or whatever, because it's usually people that love technology, but the question is how we build it in a way, and also that's something that GDPR does not do well. There could be way more options to kind of allow that and have like good solutions to it, but that usually didn't make it through the political process in Brussels. We basically have a bit of a copy of the law from the 90s, really. And whenever any country does GDPR, there's lots of room to make these things do better. But I think with a combination of that, there is a lot of possibilities to overcome these issues. But as always, to be totally frank, there will be certain cutbacks. Like if you say you want to limit climate change, that limits how much we can fly around the world 24/7. There's just a limit to that. But we can still think how to be more efficient in everything else and therefore fly a little bit. You know, I think that's where we're going to go.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions and 5 minutes left, please.
Hi, Sergei Koshman. I'm with Public Broadcaster in Ukraine, and my question most probably to Max. I'm really wondering, on the one hand, we hear that we have to drive great content to the audience as much as we can. On the other hand, I hear this restriction that this public broadcaster is not supposed to put something on YouTube, and you couldn't find actually anything online, and to compete with the malevolent actors is quite hard. So what's your idea on the public broadcasters in this whole kind of war against disinformation? Are they major actors, or they just decorate beautifully the battleground that is happening between other actors? And maybe the second minor question, is there any digital obligations? Not concerned with the big tech corporation, but with citizens. Are we supposed to do something duly on a daily basis? Thank you.
I'll briefly respond that, for example, you have privacy-protected search engines, like EU develops such, but it's not very popular, in fact. So we all still use like Google or, I don't know, hopefully not anyone, nobody use like Yandex in this audience.
I forgot the first question, I'm sorry, for the public broadcasters. I think, I'm not an expert in that, so this is my little citizen's opinion, what I'm saying right now. I think it strongly depends on the countries and how they're set up. In Austria, the public broadcaster's webpage is the most visited page in the whole country. So that just means that I think half of every Austrian is looking at that page every day, and most of them have it as the start page on their browser. And that then in that country is just a huge force of information. In other countries, we have, I don't know, I think Israel just turned down their broadcaster or something at a certain point and shut it down. Like it fundamentally changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction what role they have, what historic role they have, how much they were politically influenced, how much people trust them. In Austria, went through all of that in the 60s, but now there's like reasonable trust in them. And I think that's probably to be answered different for each jurisdiction and even sub-jurisdiction between, you know, different parts of countries and so on as well. At least in Austria, that's like the one big weight that we have. Also because we're a small country, you also have to think we're 8 million people. So a normal newspaper cannot succeed and not pay their employees from the amount that you're selling. So you need to kind of have public money in journalism to even be able to actually have a full-size newspaper somehow, because we simply don't have the market. And so that, I think, depends strongly.
Yeah, I encourage the people who ask questions like to approach our panelists after the panel if you want to some extended answers. And we have last question, please.
Thank you for interesting discussion. I'm Vyacheslav Bihun, filmmaker and legal scholar. I understand my definition of rights is it is a need which is guaranteed by law. Now, to follow up what Sergei said, let's talk about obligations. I mean, not now, but in general. I understand if you have a right, somebody has to have obligation. Now, I have obligations as well and rights, so I can self-defense myself by, let's say, self-isolation. When I read disclaimer, I can say to what permissions I agree, to what I do not agree. Then we can oblige some corporations to do some things in respect of our rights. Then we can oblige also state to regulate this field. But the problem with digital rights is that it is not a jurisdiction-based right. So what we give to somebody else, and let's face it, they use our ego to drive information out of us, then we become victim of that. So who is actually the major guarantor? Do we have somebody else who will guarantee our rights or obligations, and who will carry on this mission of obligations? Thank you.
Anyone?
So it is a little hard to hear up here, I think. So I think it's really important that we disaggregate rights from obligations. Like, rights are indivisible, inalienable, they're available to all people to enjoy regardless of who they are and regardless of obligation. I think we think about duty. Where does the duty lie? It lies with the state. It's the state's responsibility to provide and ensure that an individual's rights are respected and protected. And now we have also the guiding principles on business and human rights. It also provides that respect, protect respect and remedy framework as well for technology companies. There's not just the obligation of the state, that it's also the obligation and duty of the company, and in our realm, the tech company. So, you know, how we as individuals experience rights is clearly shifting, and it's being disrupted in the digital environment. So how do we experience our right to privacy in the digital age is not the same as how we experienced our privacy before communication surveillance technology, for instance. So that evolution of how we understand and claim our rights, separate to the obligations, like separate to that is like, I think is the question, how do we understand it in terms of service? Who knows? How do we understand our rights of expression in the context of the algorithm that we have no transparency into? Another major question. So I think it's that the state's responsibility and duty, again, that of the company, and then the information and availability and the enjoyment that the individual has in the digital age that we have as a question. I'm not sure if I totally answered your exact question, but we can talk afterwards.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and on the right of moderator, I want to each of you from Ukraine to invite you to Internet Governance Forum Ukraine, which took place in Kiev on September 23. This is one of the panel, one of the events to discuss digital rights as well. And I do encourage you as audience to participate on the global events in the conference RightsCon and Internet Governance Forum on the global level. I want to thank Aspen for bringing this topic to the discussions. We are here in Ukraine on the early stage of in-depth discussions about digital rights and their implications. And I also want to thank you, each of you who joined us. You had a huge trip here, and you flew, two of you arrived here at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in Kiev just last night. So thank you for being very active. And I want to ask you to thank you all our panelists. And thank you as the audience for being active and asking questions. Please feel free to approach our panelists for further discussions. Thank you.